So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the painting directly behind me. This is a work called Fawn. It was done in about 1973, and it's by a guy named Willem de Looper. I'm going to sort of step out of the way so you can get a little bit better view of this enormous painting, but it's about 10 feet long. Willem de Looper, if I remember correctly, he immigrated from Holland, from the Netherlands, ended up in New York at a very young age, and then DC. He was in Washington, DC. He started out, I think, this, if I'm remembering this correctly, I think he started out as a security guard at the Phillips Collection in Washington, DC, but studied art, studied painting, and then through education and through experience, worked his way up to the Phillips Collection until he was a curator there. He is considered what we call a second generation color school artist. So this is an artist that is part of the Washington Color School. The first group, Gene Davis and his contemporaries, they came into prominence in the mid-'60s. Willem de Looper was right on their heels. So he started coming up in the late 60s, early 70s with his paintings. And the whole thing about the color school was, number one, they're non-objective. So you'll stand in front of this for 100 hours and you will not see a fawn or any other sort of recognizable object. What you will see is deliberately poured and placed pigments. This is acrylic paint. So acrylic paints, as opposed to oil paints or watercolors, first started coming onto the market in a big way in I think it was 1964. And so they really made a huge impression on a lot of new and up and coming contemporary artists, or I should say, soon to be contemporary artists. And they were having a lot of fun with the physical properties of acrylic paints. Also, this is another example of chemical coloration. So these are synthetic colors, which means for our purposes, they're very bright. They're very festive. They are intense, really, really saturated colors. But acrylic paints, unlike oil paints, can be diluted in water and it can be poured. And so what a lot of color school artists and other artists outside of the Washington Color School, like Helen Frankenthaler in the 1950s, 1960s, but especially in the 60s, they were pouring acrylic paint, diluted acrylic paint, across unprimed canvases and allowing the cloth, the materiality of that canvas to absorb the acrylic paint and to then turn around and layer up different washes, basically, of this coloration. So you'll see streaks, you'll see deliberate placement of acrylic, bits of acrylic paint that were placed directly on the canvas and then poured over so they create these kind of streaks. You'll see some dabbing, some brushwork, but really what you're looking at a lot of is poured paint. And again, this is all about this. I mean, this is very much what the color school was about. Was just this notion of saturation, this notion of color saturation. So this is a great entree piece to talk about what is contemporary art. Contemporary art is typically sort of talked about as kind of really any art that is created after about 1970. There are precursors to a contemporary art movement. There are people that work in the styles and manners of a pre-contemporary idiom. So from about 1860 up to about 1960s, 1970, this is what we call the modern period. And then art historians and collectors and artists then sort of defined that there was a shift around 1969, 1970, and we start to call this now contemporary art. There are people working in modernist veins, even now, 50 years into contemporary art. And there were individuals before 1970 that were working in what we might sort of consider contemporary veins. But what is contemporary art? There is no solid single definition of what contemporary art is per se, except that it is artwork that sort of reflects what's happening today, reflects the sort of human condition, the human experience. But it also is artwork that helps to reframe those quality or those issues that are specific to our contemporary culture. So contemporary art, yes, it has new sort of topics, new kinds of techniques and materials that it's working with. But there are some areas that sort of talk about a complete departure from the past. I want you to think about 1969 and the uproar that was 1969. Think about moon landings, which I think was probably 1968. But think about the moon landing. Think about the Equal Rights Amendment. Think about civil rights. Think about so many of the social upheavals that are happening at the very end of the 1960s. Think about the anti-war movement. Think about how quintessentially our society began to change during this time frame. And as a result, the art world started to expand to accommodate new media like video, installation, performance. It also started to accommodate a new range of artists that would not have necessarily been able to come to the highest professional levels even a few years beforehand. So you start to see the ascendancy of artists of color. You start to see the ascendancy of a lot of professional women in the art world. And you start to see openly gay and lesbian, transgender artists working after about 1970. People that are open and sort of open about who they are. You also are seeing new topics being sort of braced by a lot of individuals. And a lot of those topics are centered around sort of the social upheavals, the new ideas that are circulating within our society. Not necessarily for everyone, not necessarily it wasn't as if sort of contemporary culture or these aspects of contemporary culture were just sort of uniformly accepted across the board. There have been lots of stumbling blocks, but there has been this sort of cultural progression happening within our society in these last 50 years. And a lot of it is sort of whispered about, or in some cases, acted upon very specifically by the artwork of that time period. But that said, contemporary art is a huge mixed bag. There is a ton of different things. Those things that were permissible in the modern period still are within the contemporary period. You just have this layering on of new ideas. So in a lot of ways, Willem de Looper is working in very much a modernist vein. He's working with non-objective paint. Jackson Pollock had already been doing this by the time that Willem de Looper comes on the scene with this painting. Jackson Pollock had already, his paintings had already been around for close to 30 years. Abstract expressionism had already been very firmly set within our society. And other artists had been working with other forms of their abstraction for a lot longer than that. So this idea of abstraction wasn't necessarily something new. Playing with this idea of materiality, playing with this almost sort of craft approach. I know that's sort of a weird thing to think about, but if you're thinking about treating the canvas as a textile and treating the paint as a dye, then you're looking at craft. So thinking about the materiality of these things and what it creates and the way that you're supposed to, the ways that you are allowed to sort of interact with these kinds of materials. This is a little bit more contemporary. This is something new.